Into your own hands. Okay, let's see. I was on the board of the Open Source Initiative for a decade, which was either a really good thing or a really bad thing. But we did work very hard to make people understand that open source is about some really basic things that are well understood in our world. And so as the movement evolved, we do things like open data comes along. You know, what is open data to us? Well, it's data that fits in an open source world. Open standards, what are those? Well, those are standards that open source people can re-implement without spending additional money and, you know, can fairly get their hands on, right, unencumbered IP. So it's an amazing thing how the open source definition really frames this whole conversation and creates this goodness. Now, how many of you guys are Stallman fans? It's okay. So we have to give Richard his due, because Richard, you know, is a visionary guy. He's like Moses. He's out there in the sandals with the rocks, and he's willing to do that. And if he had not been willing to be out there like that, things might have gone very differently. Because the people who started permissive licensing, like on this campus, Bill Joy, in the 80s started the BSD project here and came up with a license, the BSD license that was loosely modeled on something MIT was using. That license and that project, if you talk to Bill Joy today, he'll tell you that was a flop because he had to write all the code. He didn't get any usable patches. And this is, you know, maybe arrogance on his part. I mean, he is one of the great coders in the world. But he came to the conclusion that it wasn't working, and part of why we had the Java problem was because he tried to reinvent open source, and his motivations were not about giving Sun an edge so much as about maintaining compatibility, which there isn't any way to force that in the OSD. You have to allow forks. So anyway, it's an interesting piece of history that open source initiative has been important for a while. And then I've been an Apache member for kind of a long time. And this is an example, not as long as mine, this is an example of taking your career into your own hands. So the right thing to do was to help Apache get the most out of Java. But I worked for Sun, and they didn't want that to happen. But what I did was trust, and a lot of open source is about trust. I trusted the people in Apache that they were trying to do the right thing, and I helped them as much as I could. I was sort of like Mata Hari for a while, for Java. No, really. And so Apache would get these drafts of legal documents, and they'd call me up and they'd say, what does this say? And I'd read it and I'd tell them what it said, and I'd say what questions I would have asked. That's all I did. And then they'd go back and ask the questions, and they'd get answers they didn't like, and, you know, rinse and repeat until they got it to a place where it was open sourceable. So it's worth taking risks if you believe, as I do, that transparency in engineering is really the only sane way to do anything that is going to be used by a lot of people. Okay, so then I was the CTO of Wikipedia for a while. How many of you guys use Wikipedia today? Yeah. How many of you donated? Okay, I want to tell you that Wikipedia currently earns almost all of the money they run on every year from that donation appeal, that direct appeal. Last year they earned $16 million in 6 weeks, $20 at a time. What does that tell you? A lot of people gave them small amounts of money. So even if you can only afford $5 next Christmas, it's worth doing because they really do run it on a shoestring. It's the 5th largest website in the world. When I got there, guess how many ops people they have?
5.
4.5. One of them was a volunteer, so we call him a half. And I'll tell you what, they were kicking ass and taking names. That's a completely open source stack that that's proof that it can be done. And for that alone, you guys should be giving them money, right? So anyway, Wikipedia was a great adventure. And now it seems that I'm going to be helping Drupal out. Drupal. I had my first conversation with the city CRM people, I don't know, like 8 or 9 years ago now? 8 years maybe. Right at the beginning, when it started to become a viable ecosystem, maybe it was 6 years, I can't really remember, but they met me and we had tea, and they wanted to know how they could help make it a good business place, a good marketplace, and what advice. Dries was still in school. So we talked about the kinds of work that Dries could land, how that could work, how the trademark situation could work, what licensing would feel like, all that stuff. And then I didn't think about it again. And when I came to Wikipedia, of course, they're huge users of Suzy CRM, so all of a sudden I cared a lot about that project again. Did I lose godlike voice? And then I got asked recently if I was willing to be on the ballot for the new board. And it sounds like the job is going to be to help professionalize the board and make it a better vehicle for this community to get more out of that body and, push the ecosystem forward so that everybody gets to play. I love designing ecosystems where everybody gets to play. I think that's the other reason transparency is really cool, because you do still need the big companies to come in and give infusions of cash and interest, and sometimes invention. And this is one of the great things about Apache. It's designed to be a watering hole and one that's vibrant. So I'm going to show you a little bit. The rest of this is a little bit about why I got involved in open source, a little bit about why Gates Foundation cares now, and a little bit about what's going on in the world. So I started out in technology working for Apple. My degree is actually in French literature. Truly. And I'm not the only one. Larry Wall's a linguist, right? I mean, you don't have to go to CS school necessarily. And I loved Apple. I loved the products they were building. But I was working on a product that some of the engineers that had written the original QuickTime were working on. But because QuickTime was pissed off that they spun out into a new project, inside of Apple, they were kept from seeing code they had written. They had to black box their own code inside a company. And this was not an uncommon experience for me, but this was the one that really pissed me off because it made us much less effective at getting stuff done. And it convinced me that transparency was really important, right? And this is the other person who convinced me that transparency was important. So you guys know that Bill Gates famously was a kid, a 19, 20-year-old kid when Microsoft was founded, and he was going down to the Stanford Linear Accelerator auditorium to the Homebrew Computing Club, just like Steve Jobs. You guys all watched iGenius recently, right? So you all know that Steve went down to Slack as well. There were lots of people in the early days of the PC movement that met there, kind of like you guys are meeting here. And except Bill figured out very early that he wanted to hide his code because that was going to make more money. And he's not wrong. You can make a lot more money if you compile the code and hold your users hostage. The problem is they got too greedy and they held their users too hostage. It got to a point where, as a user, you could be really depressed because you find a bug that was stopping you from doing something you need to do, and you had to wait for it to be economic for them to fix it because you couldn't get at the code. And so he got to be very, very wealthy, but he did it in a bad way. Well, 15 years later, now he's a family man. I actually worked for Microsoft for 6 horrible months. I did. In 1994, I had been working for Apple, and there was a lawsuit. It settled. Microsoft wanted something that I knew, and I was interested in going up there, partly because I wanted to see why they were winning, because their products were so bad. I couldn't figure out why they were winning, and I wanted to know. But also because I wanted to work in product, and I was working kind of on the IT side of things. And at least inside of Apple, we couldn't jump over to product. And they made twice as much money, people who worked on product. And I was very interested. I was coin-driven in those days because I was a single mom and I really wanted to get it right. So I went to Microsoft. And I left on ethical grounds after 6 months. I walked. This is another thing I always tell you guys, or tell people when I speak to them. Follow your feet. Follow your heart. If something doesn't feel right, you gotta leave. It's never hurt me at any point in my career. Anyway. So now Bill's a family man. He got married the day that I joined Microsoft. And then eventually he left Microsoft and started the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which is one of the best endowed charitable organizations in the world. I kind of conflated them with Microsoft for a long time. And then I was hanging out with Mark Shuttleworth at one point, the guy who started Ubuntu. He was also very wealthy, although not as wealthy as Bill. But he has his own foundation. And I said, what do you think about Bill and Melinda? And he said, they are the only people taking on malaria It's not like we don't know that what causes malaria, but it's sort of a last mile engineering problem, and it's fussy and expensive, and nobody wants to spend on it except them. So from his perspective as an African, because he's South African, that's huge, right? They also take on AIDS education, and in this country they only work on US education. So only 3 things they hope to get right. They've had some problems getting some of it right, and they're trying to get better. But they work on K-12. And specifically, they're working on trying to make K-12 education better in this country, because this country is in trouble. How many of you have kids in the school systems in this country? Are you worried?
Yes.
Yeah, this country has some real problems in education, particularly in language arts and math. And so everybody's trying to help. But this project that I'm talking about is Gates and Hewlett and Carnegie working together to try to fix a problem. And they're leveraging a situation to get there. So they're taking a federal mandate for data collection and turning it into an opportunity to do more. So in the first approximation, they're just fixing data aggregation for No Child Left Behind, which is screwed up. Everybody knows it's screwed up. But it is the first time the federal government of this country has ever looked at all students. That's been a state's thing all this time. So if you live in Massachusetts, you're really lucky because you've got really good education, probably. But if you live in Kentucky, maybe not so much. This is the first time the government's looking at every student and going, wow, this is not working down here. We got to figure out why that's broken. The first step, because they work at a glacial pace, is to get the data collected and then aggregated. They didn't stipulate an aggregation point. Gates is working on one as a gift to some of the states, and hopefully more will adopt it. But they're being a little sneaky because they're taking that aggregation point and the fact that parents are dissatisfied. This is a graph of what parents think of schools. The blue line is what they think of schools in their community. The red line is what they think of their child, and the yellow line is what they think of schools overall in America. But it's bad, right? Nobody's happy with any of this. So they're trying to take advantage of that. And also, the fact that teachers are pretty pissed off. It's no fun being a teacher in public schools in this country right now. Partly because they're sort of half computerized. So if you're a teacher, you might have 3 or 4 or 5 different systems you have to log into in order to report the data that you're required to report under No Child Left Behind. Because they didn't make it an open ecosystem. So there are these towers of ivory, and they don't talk to each other. And it's just as broken as software in general was 10 years ago when we started doing open source. So they're trying to be a little disruptive. And they're trying to deal with the fact that they've got an unhealthy ecosystem. I used to show this slide to explain Microsoft and the software ecosystem. So, but there's been a shift. There has. So anyway, meanwhile, another piece of this puzzle is there's been a shift in assessment. So in this country, right now, students are assessed about 1,000 points between kindergarten and 12th grade. It's mostly high-stakes testing. How many of you guys took an SAT? Right? Okay. And you felt like it was going to, if you didn't get it right, it was going to be the rest of your career screwed up, right? So high-stakes testing, not everybody does well with. I bet we all did, right? Everybody feel like they did okay? Okay, well, my kid didn't do so okay on his SAT. So right now, there's 1,000 points. They're going to expand that to 30,000 points with something new called the shared learning map that maps to something called the Common Core. And a man named Danny Hillis is writing this software. You guys know who he is. He was one of the original people at Apple. And that software is going to be released under a permissive open source license, BSD, which is huge. You know, Danny Hillis is going to release a big piece of software under the BSD, and it's going to be something that's designed for every kid in America to potentially use, every parent in America to potentially use. That in itself is huge, and Gates is funding it. But then there's the whole ecosystem. Like, could we use it to actually disrupt the whole ecosystem? And interestingly enough, they're mandating that, yes, if we're going to create a sustainable system here, something that actually changes the world, and they learned this, I think, from Open Office, we should make it open. It'll drive deep adoption. And the community itself will own this thing. Just, you guys feel like you own Drupal, right?
Yeah.
Yeah? How many of you feel like you own Drupal?
I do.
Well, that's not nearly enough people. How many people think that your customers are Drupal or you use Drupal? Okay, I'm missing a category then. What do you guys that aren't raising your hands feel about Drupal?
We are Drupal.
You are Drupal. Well, you're wearing the drop. By the way, does that drop have a name?
Drupalcon.
Drupalcon? Oh, that could have been shorter. How about Droopy?
Droop. No.
You guys can ask Tracy about that later, okay? So the main reason that they wanted to open source is because of sustainability. So what would happen if, God forbid, something bad happened to Dries tomorrow and he never worked on Drupal again? You guys would pick it up and do it, right?
Yep.
That's open source. Participation is ownership in open source. They want that for their project. They want a thriving commons. They don't want the big Tyrannosaurus Rex thing to happen anymore. And they want to learn how to do this. They actually engaged me to teach them how to do this because most of these folks did come from Microsoft and they already know they don't know how to do this. And it's interesting because they ask the same questions that people were asking 10 years ago. They're just a little bit behind, you know. So we're talking to lawyers about why they don't need to rewrite licenses and things like that. And we tell them things like, look, open source is already a global phenomenon. This is that map that Red Hat maintains. You guys can go have a look at because it gets updated all the time. But darker is better in terms of how much open source participation and penetration there is. And if you look at it, you know, it's in some predictable places. Now, who's the person here from furthest away? Is there somebody from Brazil here? Argentina! Yay, Argentina! I got asked if I wanted to keynote at a conference in Argentina at some point in the future last week, and the whole thing was written in Spanish, which I can actually read happily. But I'm looking at it and I gave it to my husband and I said, should I do this? And he's Mexican. And he looked at me and what does it say? It's terrible. It's terrible. All right. So the other thing about open source is it's a really small world. We run into each other all over the world. If you go to a DrupalCon somewhere else in the world, some of the people in this room will be there too. Always. You run into people you know everywhere, and it makes you feel like kind of an army that you voluntarily became part of, and it's a nice thing. You know, when Apache turned 10, we had a little party for it, and some people got up towards the end of the evening, they'd had a lot to drink, and they said, how many of you have taken a vacation with one of the people from Apache? And it was everybody. I mean, everyone had traveled together, everyone had, you know, it becomes family very quickly, which is a nice thing, right? It's not always a happy place. By the way, Disney's a huge user of open source. Our friend Ted Lund from Apache is an Imagineer at open source now. I mean, at Disney now, helping them understand how to make better use of open source. But because of Pixar coming in, they were already a really huge user. So, but is it sustainable? I don't remember why I used that picture. This is what happens. Okay, so the question is this going to meet Gates' needs? Are they going to end up with a sustainable thing? What does that mean? What do you guys think sustainability means, based on what we've been talking about? Perfect. Well, okay, let's talk about Switzerland. It's well-funded, it's neutral. What?
The 600 million downloads of OpenOffice are actually used.
Yeah, there you go. Okay, that's sustainability, that the software actually gets used. That's one of the reasons that we're driving them towards permissive licensing, because I'm telling you, I've done a project with every possible open source license now, because I was in Sun for so long and I like to make up new ones, but we tried all these different models, and the great thing about permissive is it just says we're not going to sue you, just use the software. Right? And I realize that this is a free software license project, but as long as everybody's playing in the same pool, it does the same thing. So, how many of you guys have written an extension for Drupal? Thank you. It takes that willingness to give, and also, you need to know that you haven't had your last good idea, and you're willing to share. That openness is what's unique about this industry, in my opinion. That's how come we all get to play. So continuing to give gift economy is a really important feature. Okay, so there are still people I deal with every day who think this is going on. I'm still getting emails every day from people involved in this project who are saying things like, but if we open it, everybody will know. You know? If we open it, they'll see my code and it's not so perfect. That's a big one, right? And then they'll think my company doesn't have good people working for it, that won't be good. Oh my God, they're going to figure out how to hack it. That's a really famous one. It's very interesting to watch people who created the FUD about hackability try to back out of it for this cause. It's been very, very interesting. Because we're trying to, of course, use open source pieces for that. These are some examples of open source that's working out in the world. Because people always ask and they always want a few, so I'll just give you a few. The city of Bristol runs completely on open source. They've been doing it for a few years now. They did it because they did the analysis, they decided, the law changed in Britain and they had to include open source in their bids, and a lot of people didn't like that, but they decided to really be serious about it, and they discovered that they could do a lot more with just a little if they went ahead and did this. So value for money is the term that they use in Britain. And they're using open source because they can see the economic benefit of not paying licensing fees to some big proprietary company or companies, which is one of the reasons people do it. Kerala is, of course, the open source state in India, and it is also a communist state, and Richard does spend a lot of time in Kerala explaining why this is going to be good. But if you think about it, you know, not much software is created for people who only speak languages that exist in Kerala. So it makes more sense for them to roll their own and stay out of the melee that is proprietary software investments in India. It used to be in the early days of us going into India to talk about open source, they were very, very freaked out about it because they thought that if Microsoft got upset with them, they would pull education subsidies and the whole educational system would collapse. I mean, they were really worried about it. But I was there last December, and every office I went into, they were talking about it properly. They're not quite doing it properly yet, but they're really close. And I think it's got huge potential for the whole country, and Carola's kind of showing them all how to do it, which is pretty cool. Malaysia did this weird thing where initially we all went to Malaysia. I mean, everybody went. You know, Richard went, his parents went, God and everybody showing up in Malaysia to talk at these conferences. And they seemed like they were on a really good road, and then the political climate changed, and all of a sudden it wasn't cool. And it kind of went dark as a conversation. And now, 5 years later, things have turned again, and all of a sudden they're into it again. And the great thing is, they already have the lessons in their back pocket. You guys ever been? How many of you guys have ever been to Malaysia or know about Malaysia? You know, the weird feature of going to Malaysia is that when sitting in a room like this, where this is a predominantly male room, although thank you, ladies, every one of you. But in Malaysia, this would be a predominantly female room, and there'd be like 2 or 3 token guys. Because the country's actually run by women. And all, it seems like all the government programmers are women, which is pretty interesting. Yeah. Interesting for a Muslim state, right? Anyway, those ladies, they remembered everything we told them. They've got a plan for how to implement it, and they are so pouring their energy into getting Malaysia to run on open source now. It's really inspiring. And, of course, Brazil, which I asked earlier, hey, Argentina. The thing that Brazil did that was so cool was they tied this to national pride. So the government of Brazil looked at their World Trade Agreements and said, wow, this is not a good deal for us because we're a developing nation, so we're going to step away, right? And then they started looking at what that was going to do if they got embargoed. And it turns out they have all the other stuff they need. The only thing they don't have is software and movies from Hollywood. Right? Because they both come from the US. So they said, how can we fix that software problem? And so they just took the entire LAMP stack, the entire world of open source software, and just ported it to Portuguese. So they've got their own whole world. And every time I was in Sao Paulo the day that I decided to accept the offer from Wikimedia, which made me a media star for a minute. And all of a sudden, there was an election going on. All of the politicians wanted their picture taken with me. It's like that. So, yeah, so open source is a really big deal in Brazil. So I'm kind of assuming that you guys are already at the place of deciding that adopting open source is the right thing to do. But I just want you guys to pause for a second and think about what it was like to build websites before there was Drupal and before you guys were behind it. It sucked. It really did. I mean, it was hard. And now it's relatively easy. I mean, there's an entry ramp. People who don't think they know how to code can show up and learn a little bit and be productive and help you guys make this a bigger deal. And communicate on the web in ways that they wouldn't have been able to before. And that is a really, really big thing. It's a really big thing. So, I really want to bow to all of you guys for the work that you do. And I'm excited to serve on the board. I'm looking forward to learning about ways that I can help. And, feel free to talk to me. I'm happy to talk. And I'm really, really glad that you guys asked me to your conference as the warm-up act. I would normally take questions, but I think I might be just over time. So thanks again. Don't forget to dance tonight.
Yeah!
Party for Drupal. Oh God, you're beautiful. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you!
Our next amazing speaker